Welcome to Ransomware Tactics and Trends, a webinar by LMG Security. My name is Tamara, and I am your moderator for today. Our presenters for the webinar today are Sherry Davidoff, Matt Duran, and Karen Springer. Sherry Davidoff is the CEO of LMG Security and the author of 3 books, including Data Breaches, Crisis, and Opportunity. She is a certified penetration tester and forensic analyst and a graduate of MIT. Matt Duran is the Director of Training and Research at LMG Security and a Black Hat USA instructor. He holds his computer science degree from the University of Montana, and his malware research has been featured on NBC Nightly News. Karen Springer is the CEO and Chief Ransomware Negotiator for LMG Security. Karen is a noted cybersecurity industry expert, author, trainer, and speaker who was featured in the Wall Street Journal CyberPro. Sherry, Matt, and Karen are the co-authors of the new book, Ransomware and Cyber Extortion. Sherry, I am passing you control of the webinar.
Today we're going to talk about the new ransomware trends, and we're also going to step through the anatomy of a ransomware attack. We'll discuss attacker tactics for evasion and for encrypting your systems quickly. We'll talk about how they steal your data, and along the way we'll show you ways that you can reduce your risk of an attack. With that, let's start with some of the recent news. Just recently, some of you probably caught that a ransomware gang known as CLOP, also linked to TA505, had claimed to have infiltrated over 130 organizations. Now, they are a ransomware gang. Interestingly, they leveraged a zero-day vulnerability in software known as Go Anywhere in order to exploit these organizations. And once they were in, they decided that they weren't actually going to deploy ransomware. I guess that was too much work. They decided to just steal files instead and then threaten to leak those on the internet. So that was their method of extortion. So anyway, this is part of an interesting trend. And the irony here is that Go Anywhere is designed for security. We've seen this before where software that's used for security gets exploited. So it's used by companies that are trying to comply with HIPAA or have PCI compliance and want to securely transfer files. Now, Matt, I know we were just talking earlier, there was a zero-day vulnerability in the administrator console. This was accessible both with the on-premise and software as a service installations, correct?
That's correct, yeah. Anyone who had an admin interface that was exposed to the public internet was potentially exposed to this vulnerability, and this worked for, again, both on-premise and the software as a service hosted versions of this system.
Yep. So CISA has now added this to their known exploited vulnerabilities catalog. Check this out regularly if you don't already. It's a really great resource. If you're wondering if this is theoretical, it is not. Hackers are actively exploiting it in the wild. We've already seen one major data breach get announced. The healthcare giant CHS has announced that they were hacked and that the gang stole over 1 million patients' information. So unfortunately, we are already seeing the ripple effects of this. Now, I mentioned that we've seen this type of thing before, and in fact, we've seen it before from CLOP. Some of you may remember back in 2021, the same gang that was linked to the CLOP ransomware also hacked organizations using a zero-day vulnerability in Exfiltrate, which again was 20-year-old software used to securely transfer files. So why are the criminals going after this? Well, they know that that's where the jewels are kept, right? If you're going to be using security software, you're probably storing some sensitive information in there. So they went after that. They ended up hacking a bank very publicly, as well as many, many other organizations. They threatened to leak customer data, employee data, and then they started actually doing that. So this was one of the earlier examples of exposure extortion that we were seeing, and it's only gotten worse over time. So what can you do to prevent this? Well, first of all, a patch was released. Matt, do you want to share some technical details here?
Yeah, of course. So the Go Anywhere manufacturers have released a patch, patch 7.1.2. This was released in early February of 2023 after the disclosure of this zero-day vulnerability, which they have come out and said is being exploited in the wild. They also gave a list of indicators of compromise on their website that you can look for in your log files if you run one of these Go Anywhere systems to see if you were potentially impacted by this. Now, we mentioned before that this was a zero-day that only affected exposed admin interfaces on the public internet. But if one of these actors makes it into your network and they can gain access to that admin console, this zero-day will function. So we highly recommend everyone run, don't walk, patch your systems right now, and don't fall victim to the same kind of exploit.
You know, Matt, one thing we often don't talk about is segmenting your network as well. We've been saying what's old is new again. And some of these basics, like just making sure that admin interface isn't accessible from a workstation where somebody clicked on a phishing email, that's really important as well. So just wanted to bring that up. And then we've also found, of course, that you want to monitor your attack surface. The majority of organizations hacked had administrative interfaces that were accessible online. From the articles, there were thousands of these available. You're seeing a screenshot from Shodan of administrative interfaces that were accessible that could easily have been exploited. And we also need to be prepared for these zero-day patches. So it's really like defense in depth, a multi-layer process. But Matt, Karen, I thought that the Clop ransomware gang was arrested. Aren't they dead?
Well, it would appear not. It looks like the members of the Clop ransomware gang that were arrested, which we all got to see on the internet and watch videos of Ukrainian police taking them down. Honestly, it looks like they only caught a splinter of that group, and other members have now kind of taken up the reins and have restarted the malicious activities before. And the splintering that we're seeing from these groups is not really that strange of a thing at this point. Looking at the screen in front of you, you can see a really nice example of how these cyber extortion groups are splintering off and kind of forging their own paths. Now, we all know that Conti has kind of gone the way of the dodo at this point. The Conti ransomware group, which at one point was the most prolific ransomware group on the planet, has disbanded. Now, that doesn't mean they've gone away. As you can see from the chart in front of you, this just means that a lot of their operators have split off into other organizations. So we see Quantum Ransomware, Blackbyte, Black Basta. All of those are increasing their market share in the ransomware industry at this point, and they're all kind of disciples of that Conti group's original formation.
All right, raise your hand if you're a Marvel fan. I'm raising 2 hands. For those of you that are Marvel fans, you can kind of think of ransomware gangs like Hydra, cut off 1 head and 2 more shall take its place. So anytime you read in the news like X ransomware gang was shut down, you really want to be taking that with a grain of salt, right, guys? Because that doesn't mean they've arrested every single person involved in that gang. They've maybe arrested some leaders. They've maybe just arrested somebody that a certain government doesn't want to be out there. And typically the rest of that gang is still free, often has taken source code or things like that, and you still see that ransomware active in the future, or at least the people associated with it. All right, so ransomware, even though we've seen some peaks and dips over the past couple of years, ransomware is still seen as the top cyber threat out there. So this is from a survey by Marsh and Microsoft that came out last spring, showing that ransomware attacks are the top issue for 71% of companies, 79% if you happen to be based in Europe. And then second to that is a privacy breach. And that makes sense because those 2 issues really go hand in hand these days, where if somebody can access your files and lock them up, often they also steal them as well, and that's a privacy issue. Here's another study from the Ponemon Institute. I thought this was very scary. This shows the impacts of ransomware attacks specifically in healthcare. So what they're seeing is ransomware attacks, and that's the one in blue, are the leading cause of delays in procedures and tests. They result in a longer length of stay, almost 60% of the time, and there's increased patient mortality. Ransomware attacks are linked to increase in deaths when they occur in healthcare institutions. So there's real life or death consequences associated with it. Of course, we've been seeing more and more of the trend of exposure extortion. And part of that, I think, is because ransomware is a lot harder, right? So with ransomware, criminals have to develop specialized malware or buy it. They have to deploy it. Then they have to maintain the keys. So you need to have the decryption key that matches what you've actually encrypted. You might have to go do customer support, which Karen will talk about in a little bit, and go through proof of life. You basically have to do technical support for your victims. And then your reputation matters. If people get a sense that you're not going to actually deliver decryption keys, why are they going to pay you in the first place? So the bottom line is that ransomware is kind of hard, and it's an investment, whereas breaking in, stealing information, and then threatening to leak it to the world, not as hard. And in fact, a lot of times we see you don't actually have to steal information. Not to take us on too much of a detour, but Karen, Matt, I know you guys had a case not too long ago where you weren't even sure that the criminals had stolen the data, right? Weren't they just like sending some screenshots? Can you speak to that?
Yeah, they kept sending screenshots of the directory structure, and every time we requested, no, actually send us a copy of the file, they wouldn't do it. So led us to believe that they probably did not have the data. They just had access and gotten screenshots.
Yeah, I think that's a big issue. Did the victim still have to treat that as a data breach in that case? Do you recall?
Yes, they did, because it clearly showed that they had, in fact, accessed their systems in some way.
So that's kind of amazing. The criminal in this case didn't even have to steal the data. They didn't even have to have a place to store it. They just had to take screenshots and say, we've got your data, nah. And then that put the victim at risk and they had to treat it like a data breach. So we're likely going to see exposure extortion remaining widespread because of that. Okay. Let's talk about HackMe Inc. HackMe is our favorite punching bag these days. HackMe Inc. got hit with ransomware. Poor HackMe. This is a problem not just for HackMe, for the world, because HackMe is actually the world's top manufacturer of widgets. And as we all know, this serves a very important function in our society. HackMe Inc. has 24/7 requirements. They also collect highly sensitive customer information. What's going to happen? Okay, two important people on HackMe's team. One, Justin Time. Justin is the IT administrator. And then Layability. Layability is the finance clerk. She deals with the dollars and cents over at HackMe Inc. Now here's your hacker, Evil Matt in LMG's laboratory. There we go. Evil Matt is the founder of the Elite Giraffe ransomware gang, and they're going to hack HackMe Inc. and deploy ransomware. So Evil Matt, let's talk about, first of all, what you're going to do. Remember, when someone is hit with a ransomware attack, that is like the tip of the iceberg. That's usually the last phase that you see, the extortion piece. It's all a process, though, and we go through this in our new book. This is the anatomy of a cyber extortion attack in the book, where hackers break in, they expand, they appraise, meaning they figure out what they have access to. Then they're going to prime the environment, get ready to deploy ransomware or get ready to exfiltrate data, whatever it is that they're trying to do. Then they gain leverage. That's going to be where they detonate ransomware or they exfiltrate data. And then they launch their extortion attack. So it's this whole big process. So Evil Matt, why don't you talk about how you break into HackMe Inc., walk us through this attack, and how you ultimately pull them hostage.
Of course. So when we're talking about how hackers break into networks, one of the biggest ways that attackers break in normally, well, there's really two. There's remote access to an exposed service like a VPN or remote desktop, or there is the use of something like a remote access Trojan. And so we decided to go ahead and follow along with some of the playbooks that the big ransomware groups are using out there, just to showcase what that kind of looks like. Now, to do that, we first had to find a remote access Trojan that would work for our needs. And lucky for us, these are available all over the place on hacker forums, on the dark web, pretty much anywhere you look that cybercrime is taking place or is being advertised, you will find something like this. What we found was a rat called the X-worm, and this is a remote access Trojan that's been around for a little while, but was recently ported over to the Rust programming language, and we'll talk about why that's important here in just a minute. Now, we found an advertisement of a developer who had been working on this, and just as kind of a clout-building measure, they were offering this up on the dark web for pretty much anyone who wanted to grab a copy of it. So, of course, we did. We went over to a non-file, we downloaded the zip, we tossed it into our malware lab, and we opened up the software to see what it looked like. And we'll show you kind of what that looks like here in just a minute. But this was a fully featured piece of remote access software. It was very, very hard for us to detect on the network. We'll talk about tips and tricks for detecting things like this as we go. But it allowed us to gain that initial foothold into the network. Now, when we're talking about how these things show up onto people's computers, one of the biggest ways this happens is through the use of social engineering, or the use of a malicious document in a phishing email. In this case, Leah, our favorite finance clerk to pick on, receives a phishing email that is very vague, very generic. It comes from accounts payments at yahoo.com, but it comes from someone named Jeremy Allen. These are names that can be spoofed and moved around to make these emails look a little bit more valid. Attached to that email is an invoice, and it's a Word document. Again, this is a very common method that attackers use to get into networks. Word documents, Excel spreadsheets, and more recently, OneNote files have been used heavily to gain access. Now, once Leah opens the document, because of course she wants to look at what this invoice is, she's going to be presented with something like this. And again, if you've worked around email for long enough, you've likely seen something very similar to this come through your inbox. It's a Word document, it opens up, and it says something along the lines of, in this case, this was created on a Windows 10 mobile device, so you're going to need to enable some features to be able to actually interact with this document. Remember, what the attacker is trying to do here is get you to click on that Enable Content button at the very top of the screen. You can see it in that yellow banner right above the Word document. Once you click this, this is what allows the malware to actually infect your system. So a reminder, don't click that if it pops up unless you're absolutely sure where it's coming from. Now, when we click that Enable Content button, this is what actually happens on the back end. So we have some obfuscated code that's embedded into the back end of that document. Once that executes, it sends off a PowerShell command in your computer that then reaches out to a web server, grabs that malicious payload, and then drops it onto your computer. And you can see different segments of that we ran through with testing of our malicious document in the lab. It's looking at servers in Germany, it's looking at other servers in the US, and a Word document realistically shouldn't be doing that. So again, opportunity for detection here, but you need to have your network tooled correctly to be able to identify these threats. EDR systems can be very, very helpful with this. Now, once that detonates, we are essentially into the computer, and we'll show you kind of what that looks like here. This is the attacker's dashboard, though. So this is our X-worm rat, and this is showing that we do have a victim now infected with the Trojan. And handily, we also get a nice little pop-up on our screen on our attacker workstation anytime a new victim is infected. So we get a nice little cataloged list. But you can see some of the information we get just right off the bat. We get things like the operating system that they're using. We get the username of the user that we just infected. We get the IP address of the workstation, and we have the ability to remotely interact with that computer. The screenshot that you see that's right up at the front is us opening up a shell and running some commands just to make sure that we do actually have access, and you can see we are identifying that we are Leah from the Hack Me Inc. domain. This is all happening outside of the user's view. Leah cannot see any of this going on, and as far as she knows, her computer is still running perfectly normally. Now, we talked about the fact that this was based or ported over to the Rust programming language, and this is a trend that we have seen in malware, ransomware specifically, over about the last year or so. The reason for this is these exotic programming languages or non-standard programming languages are very, very difficult for your regular antivirus software to detect. If you're just running something like Windows Defender or Bitdefender or something like that, there's a pretty good chance that this is going to be able to run without being detected because the signature-based features that antivirus uses don't really function on these programming languages. You can see a couple articles we have up on the slide here. Source code for Rust-based info stealers has been released publicly in a number of different instances at this point, and we also see a definite shift in ransomware gangs specifically moving to these languages. It also allows us to function on both Windows and Linux-based systems, so we can go after things like ESXi hosts, we can go after your hypervisor. A lot of really bad things can happen if this malware gets onto your network. Now, once we're in the door, we want to take a couple of steps as the attacker to make sure we have persistent access to this system. So the very first thing that we are going to do is we're going to give ourselves a secondary means of accessing this computer. In this case, we're just going to use the splashtop streamer. And this is a very, very common tactic that we see. Attackers will make their way in the door, they'll get that initial foothold, and then they'll drop legitimate remote management software onto the victim's computer that allows them to access full interactive remote desktop sessions whenever they want to. I do this with a single command through the remote access Trojan, and now we have full access into the system. Once we have that access, we can start looking around at what's going on this computer. We can look at the desktop, we can start adding files to it, we can start pulling files back out of it, which we'll showcase here in just a minute, but it gives us that access we're looking for. The other thing we're going to do is start dropping some of our tools onto this system, and in a lot of cases, these are going to be dropped into things like the pictures folders, or in this case, the video folder of the victim. A lot of times in a corporate environment, users on their computers don't look in things like the videos folder because most of the time you don't need to. So this makes a great place for me to stage things and drop in tools that I'm going to need to compromise a little bit further. Now, we mentioned before that this was ported over to Rust, and the reason that we went with this one was because we wanted to showcase it not being detected by antivirus. You can see a couple examples of that here on the screen. We have a Windows Defender scan or a Microsoft Defender scan that did not pick up that this computer was infected. We ran a hash value for this piece of malware through VirusTotal. We got 0 results back. And then right up at the top there, you can see us actually looking at the task manager. And this is where things get a little, we're going to make a little bit of light of this, but it's a serious problem. You can see the little cogwheel icon and then the blank space next to it. That is our malware running on this system, which is conveniently in the list running right next to the Antimalware service executable. So my Windows Defender is running right now, but it just has no idea that this is a malicious piece of software. And again, that's kind of by design. That's why we moved to these other programming languages. We also talked about the use of that legitimate remote desktop application, and again, this is something that we see as a big trend. In a lot of ransomware investigations, one of the things that we will always look for right off the bat is the use of tools like Splashtop or Atera or any of the other common remote monitoring and management software suites that IT and MSP organizations will use. The reason being, these get overlooked in a lot of cases because they are not malware. They are not something that's going to be detected by antivirus. A lot of times the users of the system are not going to notice that this is running because, well, there's already probably remote monitoring software running on there. And oftentimes these are available as free trials. They are open source projects. They are low cost, and they're very well maintained and fully featured pieces of software. So instead of having a piece of malware to do this, I can just use a really nice, robust remote monitoring management utility to do pretty much whatever I want to on this system. Now, this leads to how we detect these problems in the first place. Now, we've already mentioned ad nauseum at this point that these things are not detected by antivirus. So what we want to look at here is something like endpoint detection and response software, EDR software. This is going to be real-time continuous monitoring. This is going to look at the actual behavior of applications on the network, and it's going to flag on things that are specifically out of the realm of normal. There's a lot of these that now have artificial intelligence integrated into them or machine learning integrated into them, and they can be very useful in detecting these more clandestine things. Now, people ask, what's the difference between EDR and antivirus? Well, EDR is kind of like the next generation of antivirus. And in fact, a lot of EDR software systems like CrowdStrike have antivirus kind of integrated into them. They're able to spot things that antivirus software will, but they get a whole lot more. So basically, antivirus is like the McDonald's Quarter Pounder, and EDR is like a steakhouse cheeseburger. It's just a much nicer and more robust version of that software. So again, once we're into the network, now we need to think about how we continue to avoid this software and how we move farther through. That brings us up to our next step here. And that's going to be our expansion. Now, we have access to one computer so far. That's great. But we probably want to have access to a lot more in the network. The first thing we need to do is figure out where things actually exist. Like, what would we have access to from this user's workstation? And again, to get this kind of information back, we are going to avoid tripping antivirus software. We're not going to use malware to do this. We're not going to do anything noisy. We're probably just going to use something like a commercial piece of IT software. And in this case, we're going to go ahead and use Advanced IP Scanner. And this is one that we have found in countless ransomware cases. It always shows up usually on domain controllers or other things like that. But it's used to basically map and recon the network. Using this simple tool, which I don't need to install, I can just run directly off an executable. I can scan the entire network, get host names, get IP addresses, get manufacturers of the devices on the network. I can get any shared folders that are made available from those systems. And I can really map out what my attack strategy is going to be at this point. The other nice part too, since this runs without having to install, I can bypass a lot of security features like user account control on Windows systems specifically. So now I have an idea of what's going on in the network, and now we need to find a way to make our way into those systems specifically. Now, we mentioned before, we have access to Leah's workstation. Leahability is a low-privileged user. She does not have access to a ton of stuff in the network, but there are ways that we can expand our footprint pretty easily inside of a network. And we'll talk about, if you guys want to know about proactive measures you can take to stop this kind of attack from happening, let us know. Happy to walk through it with you. There are measures you can take to make sure this doesn't happen. But in the very first instance I'm on the computer, what I'm probably going to want to do is look at things like sessions available. Now, we've all heard of, or you may have heard of an application called Mimikatz before. Mimikatz targets a very, very specific area of the Windows operating system that can, in some configurations, hold clear text credentials. To get access to this, there's a couple steps I need to take. So if I'm going to drop a copy of Mimikatz onto a workstation that I've just taken over, like Leah's workstation, very well-known piece of malware, and that's going to light up antivirus software like a Christmas tree. I don't want to do that. I want to remain hidden in this case. So all I'm going to do now is open up Task Manager. I'm going to find the local security authority process, and I'm going to dump that file right into Task Manager. In a lot of cases, this won't trip antivirus or behavioral detection software because it is a system function. There are other ways to go about this that will, but we can talk about that out of band if you'd like to. But once I create that dump file, I can go ahead and ferry that off to another workstation that I have access to. In this case, I pulled it over to a Linux workstation that I was using and extracted the clear text credentials from there. Because our IT administrator will likely have had access to that, he may have a saved session, and in this case, he did. You can see we're pulling back the information for the user just in time. We're getting his domain username, we're getting his domain password, and now we have the ability to act as that user on the system. Now, because he's the IT administrator, he's going to have access to quite a few different areas of the network, and this is where we start to expand our footprint. We already identified using that Advanced IP Scanner where the domain controller is. We know where the file server is. So we're going to use his credentials and just remote into those services, or into those servers. There is a pretty good chance there's going to be a remote desktop access available, or at least some kind of remote access, because it's, again, we're inside the network. This is pretty common. But now we have access to pretty much everything that we need. Now, the very first thing I'm going to do at this point as the attacker is fully expand my footprint. I have administrative credentials, I have access to the domain controller, so now what I can do is use another legitimate piece of software, something like the PS Toolkit from Microsoft. This is very commonly used by IT admins to deploy software, and I can go ahead and push my remote access Trojan out to everything else on the network. Now I have access to everything, and I have that same kind of backdoor access I had before, and you can see an example of that here. Using a pretty simple PowerShell command, I can go ahead and push my malware out to anything that registers on the domain. I don't need to know the host names. I don't need to know the IPs. I can just enumerate the entire domain and install. And then you can see our attacker dashboard has now expanded in the number of these hosts that we have access to. The reason that we go through, or the reason that we decided to go through and do it this way is because this is a standardized playbook that we see a lot of attackers using. Now, you may remember last year there was some disagreements internally with the Conti ransomware gang, and a researcher and a Conti affiliate both released a bunch of information about Conti to the public for them to review. This included things like their standardized attacker playbook, and this was a really great roadmap for how to take over a network. Honestly, we could probably hand this off to a rookie pen tester. They'd be able to completely compromise a network just using the steps that were in there. And you can see some of the examples there. We have normal IT tools and instructions that come along with the playbook. They're telling us what to use and how to use it. And then, as I was talking about Mimikatz before, here's the section in Conti's playbook talking about how to use Mimikatz to scrape credentials from the system. We followed right along. It worked perfectly. So it makes sense that this is a very common and much reused kind of tactic. A lot of ransomware groups use this exact playbook.
The question is, what do they do? What do you do once you take over the network? And I thought that this chart was really interesting because it shows how long the attackers are dwelling in your environment. And interestingly, for smaller organizations, they're actually dwelling in there longer, over 50 days, on average 52 days, in fact. But even for the large organizations, you're still seeing them dwell for more than 2 weeks. Look at those bottom numbers right there, 19 days, 20 days on average. So for us as defenders, that's an opportunity. We could potentially be catching the attackers in the environment before they really decide to blow things up, but all too often we are just not seeing them. So let's talk a little bit about what they're doing when they're dwelling. A lot of times they are appraising your environment. And Karen, you're our chief ransom negotiator. I know a lot of what they do is in preparation for the negotiation piece, figuring out how to gain leverage. Can you speak to that a bit?
Yeah, absolutely. I tend to think of it as like Antiques Roadshow for your data. So they're looking around to see what's valuable. Anything that they can sell or exploit is what they want. And when we talk about selling, we're not just talking about the data, but also access to your data. So they may be stealing the data themselves to exploit it, but they may be looking around and saying, oh, I could get a lot of money for this on the dark web and sell this access to others who will then exploit it as well. So anything that has personally identifiable information, including health insurance information, things like that for customers or for employees, and of course, financial information and anything that's proprietary. If it's valuable to your organization, it's valuable to them. And you'll see the headline down there about it. The ransomware gang is targeting firms who have cyber insurance. And literally, as we were hopping on this webinar, we got an updated version from our research intern that said there is a group right now that is very specifically setting their ransoms based on what they know the insurance will cover.
Yeah, and Karen, I love your analogy. I think like Antiques Roadshow, a lot of times victims have no idea how valuable their data is. You may not know you have the Mona Lisa sitting on the wall of your living room because your great-grandmother gave it to you. Often hackers understand that they can take your employee data or your customer data and sell it on the dark web for a good chunk of change. And sometimes even things like source code are not as well protected as you might expect because tech companies may not realize how valuable that is to attackers.
Absolutely.
So, Leaf Giraffe ransomware gang, what did you do next? You're appraising the organization.
Yeah, exactly. Just like Karen said, we want to go through and see what's actually available on that system. And since I have this, nice remote access to Leah's computer, I may as well start there. So one of the first things I'm going to do is look at the local files on the system. What does Leah have saved on her desktop? And this is obviously a problem in a lot of organizations where we may not actually know what users are saving locally versus what they're saving in access-controlled cloud systems. We also want to know what that user has access to. So since I have access to the computer, I can just pop open Command Prompt and look at what groups Leah belongs to. I can see that she is in the remote desktop users group. I can see that she is in the regular the regular domain users group. But again, I don't want to rely too heavily on her account because I want to make my way a little bit farther into the network. One of the other things I really want to look at is what cloud services she has access to. And this gets overlooked in a lot of cases. We tend to think of ransomware and cyber extortion operators as only stealing data from local networks, and unfortunately that's just not the case anymore. Attackers know that you're storing a lot of valuable data in the cloud. You know you're storing a lot of valuable data in the cloud, so why wouldn't they look for those systems too? With this kind of access, I can access those cloud systems very, very easily. I'm going to bypass things like multi-factor authentication. Oftentimes I'm going to bypass even needing credentials to access because this is a trusted user's device, and you can see examples of that on the screen. We have a synced OneDrive folder, which has a lot of data in it that I can just go ahead and pull right from the computer. I can also pop open a web browser and go directly into that user's Microsoft 365 system at this point. So now I have access to SharePoint, I have access to email, to Teams, to OneNote, to really anything else this user would have access to. And again, this is bypassing a lot of those security controls that we kind of rely on to keep this data safe, mainly just because of my posture inside the network. Because I have access to an admin's credentials at this point, though, I'm not going to stop just at that one individual user. I'm going to go straight for the admin dashboard and see if I can get access to that. And in this case, because I had access to Justin's username and because I had access to his roaming profiles on a lot of these systems, I was able to open up his web browser and grab his username and password for Microsoft 365. And now I have access to the admin console, meaning I can do things like adjust file permissions, I can create new shares, I can transfer things out of the network, I can create users, which we'll talk about here in just a second, that may give me more permanent access to the system, and a lot more. So being very conscious about where those credentials are being stored and how they're being used becomes really important. You've heard us talk before about not saving just not saving credentials directly in your web browser. This is one of the reasons why we say that. They are not necessarily secure if they're saved in a regular application like Chrome or like Edge or something like that. It's pretty trivial to extract this data, and there's a lot of damage we can do once we have access to it.
This is a concept you really defined in the book, and I was really glad you created this as part of the anatomy of a ransomware attack, because I think this is where you start to see a lot of signs that there is impending doom, right? Can you explain to us what priming is and then show us how you did it?
Yeah, of course. So as a cyber criminal, when I make my way into a network, the network may not be in the shape that I want it to be in for me to successfully do something like deploy ransomware to every single computer on the network, or there may be shares that I don't have access to, or something along those lines. So to prime the environment for detonation, there's a couple steps that me, as the attacker, probably wants to take. And since I have access to the domain controller, I can affect those changes on a domain-wide basis fairly easily. One of the very first things I'm going to do is get rid of your security software. And usually I'm going to do this through something like group policy, or if I have access to like a central console for like, say your managed antivirus or something like that. I can pop in, I can allow list my own software, I can turn it off completely, or I can make changes to it to make it a little bit easier for me to make myself through. And you can see the two group policy adjustments I'm making here. Right now we're going after Microsoft Defender, but there are other ones we can do in the same fashion. We're turning off real-time protection, so it's not actively scanning, and we're turning Defender Antivirus completely off on all of the workstations. This is going to propagate to everyone in the network, and now nobody has any security software to stop me from hitting them with ransomware, even if normally Defender would detect that software in the network. The next thing we want to do is start looking at file share permissions. And to do that, we can go ahead and enumerate shares on the file server and figure out where things list. So we can do this using PowerShell. Again, we're not using malware to do this. We're just going to use local system tools so we don't trip antivirus software. And so we blend into the environment a little bit more. But here you can see us listing off the available file shares on our primary file server. We can see accounting, we can see backups, we can see finance, and then we have company info. So let's take a little spin at company info and see what we can do with that now that we know where it is and we have the credentials to impact that. Before I do that, though, again, we want to talk about persistence. And what I probably want to do is make sure that I, as the attacker, have full access to the system, even if somebody spots something that's a little bit wrong and decides to change passwords on something like the domain admin account or just-in-times account. If they do that, I'm kind of out of luck. And so what I'm going to do first is make myself a new user. Now, I have made myself into a domain administrator in the group, and because the hacker's awesome in this case, I'm going to go ahead and call myself the radmin. You can see the username, the password, and everything I'm putting in there, and I'm assigning myself that domain admin title. This now means that I can do anything I want to on the network because I have those domain admin creds. Now, I want to point out something really quick here. Sherry mentioned just a few slides back about dwell time, and this becomes really important when we're talking about things like new account creation inside of networks. If I've been in the network for 52 days at this point, the top end of that scope, and I created this user right at the very beginning, there's a chance that when the victim is impacted and restores from something like their backup system, they may just go ahead and restore my account because they're probably going to want to restore to a point that's very close to when their files were actually encrypted, so they avoid something like data loss. If they go ahead and bring me back in as the admin because they didn't notice that new account was created, well, now I still have access to their systems, and I can pop in and just I can extort them a second time at this point. A third time, I can do a lot of things. The other thing I can do is change file permissions. So you can see we're going after that company info folder here, and I'm going to go ahead and just wipe out file permissions as a whole on that entire share. This means that anyone can have access to it, especially me as the attacker, and my ransomware can now encrypt everything inside that folder without having to worry about something like a permission block stopping that from happening.
So there are ways that we can detect this, especially when you're looking at a period of over a month. And one of the big tools we've been talking about this year is identity and access management. Again, what's old is new again. This is a fancy way of naming really a collection of tools and tactics for defining appropriate roles, tracking the use of accounts, identifying misuse of accounts. So really, you should be able to throw up an alarm when just-in-time or layabilities accounts are misused like this. Or imagine if the Radmin suddenly appears. By the way, I'm going to call you that from now on, Matt. The Radmin. Okay, so once you've primed the environment, you are ready to deploy ransomware, exfiltrate your data, whatever it is that you're trying to do, you're going to gain leverage. And there's multiple ways that attackers will gain leverage in an environment. We've talked about exposure extortion, so that's where they threaten the confidentiality of information resources. There is, at least in theory, the idea that you could threaten the integrity of information resources by modifying things, but more often we see threatening of the availability, so they will lock up all your data. That's classic ransomware, or sometimes distributed denial of service attacks like we've seen recently with Killnet. So there's multiple ways there to gain leverage. The last one there, faux ransomware, is when the criminals pretend that something's a cyber or a ransomware attack, but it really isn't. We saw that with NotPetya, where they got people to pay them money, but they didn't actually unlock their data. So in this case, the elite giraffe gang decided to exfiltrate data. So Matt, tell us what we're seeing on the screen here.
Yeah, so when we're exfiltrating data from a network, because of the access that we have a couple of decent ways that we can go ahead and steal data from the network. Obviously, one of those ways is using that remote access Trojan that we already have. And this particular remote access Trojan had a full file explorer and file extraction feature just built right into the software. Once a computer's infected, all I have to do is click from my admin dashboard. I can open up a file browser. I can find things like the share folder on the file server, and just with a quick right click and a click on download, I can now download the entirety of that folder to my attacker's workstation. Now, this may set off some flags because we're downloading data off to an unfamiliar IP address. This is going to be off to what's essentially my command and control server. So if we want to do this in a little bit more clandestine of a way, we can again roll back to using something like a legitimate piece of IT software. In this case, we're going to use rclone. And you've heard us talk about this one before. We find rclone evidence in a lot of cases because it is a very easy to use and fully featured program. But in this case, I'm just going to use rclone. I'm going to target those directories and just siphon everything off to an online file system like Mega or like Google Drive or Dropbox or something like that. If I'm using something that your organization uses normally, this kind of traffic may go completely unnoticed. You may not even realize that this has happened. Obviously, if I'm going to like mega.nz or something like that was a little easier to spot, but if I'm using Google Drive and your organization uses Drive, then this may just blend directly into the normal traffic that you see. It also staggers the output of these files, so the amount of your network bandwidth that I'm using is probably not going to increase enough for it to flag and for you to know that something is going wrong here. But yeah, a couple of very simple ways to just grab data and just walk it right out of the network.
This is so difficult to detect, and we see it in case after case after case. They're just using those normal IT tools. Okay, just a reminder for everyone, the cheapest way to reduce your risk is to reduce your data. What? Yes. Data is hazardous material, so the more you can reduce what you collect or delete it, set retention times on a regular basis that automatically purge, you're going to be reducing your risk in the process. And no, there's not going to be a giant ad in the airport trying to sell you that. It's just a very effective approach. In order to do that, you need to know what is on your network. So again, one really big takeaway from this year, one of the top security controls that you'll see in your handout are to conduct data discovery and data mapping on a regular basis. You can do that manually by interviewing people, by tracking things on spreadsheets. Even better is to use automated tools that will crawl your network and discover the data for you. So just one way that we can help to combat these risks. Okay, So then Lead Giraffe decides to also launch ransomware. So it's a double extortion attack. Nice. Matt, tell us a little bit about how you choose ransomware and what you chose in this case.
Yeah, so there's a few things that we wanted to look at while we were picking our ransomware for this particular demonstration. One of them was to showcase the ease of access to malicious software like this on things like darknet marketplaces. You can see the Alphabay market and the Versus market both here. These are two big places where we see a lot of malicious software being sold, including ransomware. Now, in this case, we have a couple of examples here. The one in the back, the 2022 ransomware starter pack, includes things like source code, instructions, and a bunch of other useful information. It goes for about $100. I mean, it's fairly cheap. Up in the front, you see the blackmail Bitcoin ransomware with source code. This one's even cheaper at about $14. So not a big investment to get into this kind of software, and it can be potentially devastating, especially if I am a rookie hacker and I don't know what I'm doing, and I launch this on a network that will essentially destroy everything without the ability to bring it back online.
So Matt picked Dharma for a few different reasons. Dharma has been around for a while, but they've had time to regularly refresh their ransomware.
So Dharma, over the last couple of years, has really kind of expanded on what we refer to as the ransomware as a service model. Realistically, what this means is they have a pack of malicious software they will license out to affiliates that work for them. And the software is very well put together, it's very well maintained, and it does a lot of stuff for you that attackers would normally have to have a pretty high level of technical sophistication to be able to do, or at least know to do on the network. And you can see the report we have right here from FortiGuard. They call it playing whack-a-mole with all these new Crisis and Dharma variants that are popping up because it's a very, very prolific strain of ransomware. Ransoms are low with this one, but they infect a lot of people every year, and they are a very, very high severity threat. So something to just remember as we're going through this. Now, one of the first things that we liked about this, or that I liked about this, was it automates a lot of things on the network that we would normally have to do manually. The very first thing is deleting shadow copies. Now, if you're not familiar with what this means, the shadow volume copies on your computer are basically like the snapshot saves on things like Word documents that you're working on. So if I don't delete these as a ransomware operator and I encrypt your network, a reasonably skilled technician from your IT staff or from a forensics firm is going to be able to go back in and recover those documents. So that kind of defeats the purpose of ransomware. But if I delete those first, now they are inaccessible, and my ransomware will completely tank the system. And you can see the threat ID at the bottom. This is part of the MITRE attack framework, and I included a small list of ransomware and cyber extortion groups that utilize this feature. Pretty common when we're seeing ransomware running. In fact, I'd say just about every ransomware out there does this at this point. The next thing I want to do is stop your computer from interfering with me as I'm deploying the ransomware. And the way that I can go about doing that is by disabling a bunch of services that are running on your computer. These are things that could be potentially using or accessing a file, and because of that access would stop the ransomware from being able to encrypt. Now, this is all happening automatically when I launch Dharma, so it's going to delete those shadow copies and it's going to stop all these services without me actually having to do anything. It's just a script that it runs that shuts all of this stuff off. So now I've kind of cleared the way for myself to be able to deploy this ransomware. The next thing I want to do is cover up my tracks. And this is one that from an investigation standpoint is particularly frustrating. When threat actors go through and clear things like Windows event logs, because in a lot of cases that's the only source of data we'll end up with in a ransomware investigation, it makes it really difficult for us to tell what happened. And again, you can see the MITRE framework in the background. This is a very, very well-known tactic. A lot of cyber criminal organizations, not just ransomware operators, will do this. And it is a very clearly identified threat to the network. So piping all that data off to something like a centralized SIM and not relying on local storage for that kind of information can be a lifesaver in cases like this. It also showcases how important robust logging outside of those standard Windows event logs can be if we're trying to investigate. All right, so last but not least, I want to make sure, again, that I have a full, clear path to encrypt everything on the network, or at least as much as I can get my hands on. And this is another thing that Dharma automates for us. Dharma is going to scan the network, it's going to identify any file shares that are available, and it's going to mount those shares to the workstation that I'm running my encryptor from. This means now anything that's in those folders, so the backups, the company info folder, the finance folder, all of those are now vulnerable, and my ransomware will encrypt everything that's in those shares. So now I have taken the network over, I've expanded my footprint across everything, I have mounted all the shares, I've removed roadblocks, and I have detonated across the entire enterprise at this point with basically a single click. So that's again, why we chose Dharma. They make this very, very easy. Now, one of the big trends that we're seeing here, once the ransomware actually starts its detonation, is the speed at which ransomware will take over your network. And a big trend that we've seen from a lot of ransomware groups is the use of what's called intermittent encryption. Now, if you're not familiar with this, basically what it means is the ransomware operators realize that they don't need to encrypt the entirety of a file to make that file useless for you. They only need to encrypt small chunks of it, or just the top and bottom of the actual file structure itself. And this is something that we see Lockbit doing, we see Blackbyte doing it, Black Basta, Black Cat, all of the other ransomware groups. It's intended for a few different purposes. One, drastically speeds up encryption. We've seen examples of the Lockbit ransomware binary being able to encrypt about 100,000 files in just over about 4 minutes. So that is lightning fast, almost impossible to catch while it's in the act. The other thing it can do is avoid detection by things like your EDR software or your intrusion detection systems. Because I'm not encrypting full files, this may not trip a condition that's going to alert you that something's going to happen. Regardless, by the time this runs, your files are still going to be locked up and completely inaccessible. So me as the attacker, I've gone ahead and completed my job at this point.
Great. So what we just saw was a ransomware attack from beginning to end. It started off with entry, expansion, appraisal, priming, leverage, and then finally extortion. And we saw that in multiple ways with both the data exfiltration as well as that last stage now, encryption. And this is the Dharma ransom note that lets everybody know that your files are encrypted. Matt, anything you wanted to point out in here?
Yeah, so the Dharma ransom note is unique in that it's more stylized than a lot of the ransom notes we see. Oftentimes, this will just be a text file. This one's an actual HTML document, and it gives you all the instructions on what you need to do to contact the attacker, in this case me, and how you go about making sure that you don't ruin things any farther than the attacker has already ruined them. So don't rename your encrypted files. Don't try to decrypt them using a third-party utility. The advice that they give you. But yeah, interesting ransom note. I'm a particular fan of the skull and crossbones icon. That's a nice touch.
So Matt, did you have the ability to choose your email and program it in there, or did that come prepackaged?
This one came prepackaged with the actual ransomware. In other cases, if I have access to source code, I can alter this to whatever I want it to be. But in this case, again, out of convenience, they went ahead and did this for me.
Got it. So at this point, you are in response mode, and we are coming close to the end of our presentation. If you want to really deep dive into how to respond, again, we are running a class. Hope to see some of you guys there. It is on March 9th. It is virtual, so you can tune in wherever you are. Check that out. And let's talk a little bit, finally, let's wrap up by talking about the negotiation process and how the attackers are actually gaining leverage. So this is an example of Vice Society. Vice Society is a newer ransomware gang. This is, as you can see, they have multiple sections of their blog for journalists, for victims. Actually, they have a blog that they update regularly. And I love this. Hello, everyone. We're glad that you read our blog. They have a post there about themselves. So they're actually monitoring the media, and then they brag about the places that journalists are referring to them. They say, we've been busy for too long working with the educational sector of the USA. So Vice Society is one of those gangs where we actually have an active case with them right now, but they often focus on the educational sector, although not exclusively. As you can see here, there's certainly other sectors as well. And Karen, you're really the perfect person to be talking about this. I'm curious to hear from you why you think the educational sector was targeted, because you spent almost 2 decades as the director of technology for the largest school district in Montana, correct?
I did, yeah. And I think there's several reasons why they target education, one of which is they know that due to underfunding, a lot of the institutions are not paying attention to cybersecurity. Also, just as a rule, education networks tend to be more open. They have a lot of endpoints, so they can create a lot of havoc and cause a lot of damage very quickly. They generally have a lot of bandwidth, so that gives them an opportunity to pull data very quickly. And of course, they do have lots and lots of access to data because they have not only students, but they have parents and employees as well. So in the district that I led, there were 18,000 users, but if you add in the parents and information there, it's so much more. Plus, they know they can extort parents and put pressure on the parents to try and get the school to pay.
What you're seeing here is a report from Kroll with statistics on what different industries are the most highly targeted. So education is right up there. Interestingly, manufacturing shot up during 2022, and we see different pressures on the manufacturing industry. They often have a direct correlation between operational outages, of course, and the amount of revenue that they make. So they're very, very sensitive to outages, which really places them at risk in the event of a ransomware attack. Those criminals can really get leverage. Healthcare, of course, we see that they're serving the public. They have a lot of the same pressures as the education sector. And again, we're also seeing the professional services sector highly targeted as well. We saw that also in some statistics from this year that came out from cyber insurance companies. So think about what professional services organizations you're working with and what information you share, and think about those supply chain risks. All right, so again, thinking about leverage, this is a section on the Vice Society's page for journalists. So common questions are, how did you decide to start a ransomware group? Group of friends who are interested in pen test. Often they think of themselves as penetration testers. And I can tell you as a penetration tester myself, this is not the way pen testers should operate, of course. Typically you agree on the money up front and then you do your work rather than vice versa. And then there's another question in the FAQ, can you explain your decision to publish company names data? They didn't pay. That's it. That's really the only factor in their decision. So Karen, if you could speak a little bit more, I know, again, in your negotiations, often it's a question of, do we want to communicate with the adversary? Sometimes victims, even if they know they're not going to pay, may want to still open up communications, correct?
That's absolutely right. So remember that negotiations are not just about paying the ransom. In fact, we would encourage you not to unless it's an absolute last resort. But what you can use those negotiations for are to buy yourself time while you look and determine what data do they have. Do they actually have it? You can use the negotiations to determine what they have and whether or not it is going to cause problems if it was released. And then you can start prepping for that with attorneys and insurance and public relations folks. So really look at it as more of a tactic rather than the only reason to contact them is to pay. It's something to allow you to learn more about them while you're buying yourself time and determine exactly what they have and what they're planning to do with it.
Well, thanks so much, Karen. I think that's really good insight that you can only get from the front line. So really appreciate that background. All right, the bottom line is this is our new normal. Cyber extortion is a business. They are there to receive payment. They are there to receive money. They have commercial software. And as a result, all of us need to be taking a coordinated and proactive approach. The good news is that there are things that you can do to reduce your risk in the event of cyber extortion. Number one, reduce the leverage that attackers have by reducing your data. And in order to do that, you need to discover your data, map it. All too often, we see victims find out how much data they have when it's finally leaked to the world. So you want to really be proactive about that. Make sure you're patching and monitoring your attack surface. That'll help you in cases like the Clop ransomware attack that we introduced at the beginning. Use EDR. The criminals are getting really good at blending with normal software. And so unfortunately, it's normal antivirus is just not going to cut it. And finally, really think about identity and access management. How are you implementing that? How are you detecting misuse of accounts or new accounts like the Radman? So deploy effective identity and access management, and that way that will reduce the attacker's access throughout your network. All right, again, if you have any questions, we are here. I'm Sherry Davidoff. This is Matt Duran and Karen Springer. We have a new book out. We are so excited, and we hope to see some of you in class. And with that, I will turn it back over to our moderator to moderate the Q&A.
Thank you, Sherry, Matt, and Karen. We did have a few questions that came from our audience during the presentation. The first question was, what data discovery and mapping software would you recommend?
Oh, that's a good question. It really depends in part on what you're using in your environment. We used as an example OneTrust. There's also Varonis. There's quite a few other types of software as well. So drop us a line on LinkedIn and tell us a little bit more about your environment, and we'd be happy to see if we can provide some more recommendations.
Great, thank you, Sherry. The second question is, what would be the 3 most important controls that organizations should mandatorily have in place to minimize the risk of ransomware?
I'm going to make a little plug for our top control of the quarter, identity and access management. I think that was really important. Matt and Karen, what do you guys think are the top?
I would say endpoint detection and response software is a huge element of your cybersecurity toolkit to prevent against ransomware. As we showcased earlier, a lot of times traditional antivirus just doesn't cut it anymore. So we need a little bit more robust system, something that'll actually look at the behavior on your network instead of just whether or not there's a virus. I don't know, Karen, what would be your third?
You guys took mine, but I would say also on any endpoints that are publicly exposed, make sure you are using multi-factor authentication and real multi-factor authentication, not text messages, SMS, something like that, and that your users are aware of what they should look for phishing emails and setting strong passwords.
Karen, that was 2.
Yes.
And authentication. Nice work.
Thank you all. And our last question is, what has been the most interesting or surprising case of ransomware you have seen in your line of work?
I think the most surprising one, Karen, you can tell me if you feel otherwise, but that was probably the very first case we got in because it was really a big surprise. It was 2016, 2017, and it was a transportation company that was being held hostage and everything was shut down. They couldn't figure out where the deliveries were. And back then, this was very new. And having to deal with criminals for the first time, having to negotiate for the first time. I mean, Karen, what were your thoughts?
Yeah, that's the one I was going to pick as well. And I think in part that was the first time since it was our first case that we saw exactly how destructive it could be, where not only had the criminals gotten in and encrypted everything, but they had found the backups and deleted them and then encrypted that server. And as Sherry said, they had dozens of trucks on the road and all of their trucks had computers on them that would report back and determine where should we drop this load and at what time, and they had no visibility anymore or any ways to contact those trucks. And I think also because we had to figure out kind of the negotiation process at that point in time, and the ransom ended up being 17 Bitcoin, which today would be unheard of in terms of money. I'm sure that it would have been millions, but at that time was $17,000, and even that seemed very high. Now that would be like a bargain.
Great. Thank you, Sherry, Matt, and Karen. Once again, this is Tamara with LMG Security. We would like to thank everyone who attended. Thank you and have a great day.